questions. Okay. All right, let's go on. Thank you, Natasha. Awesome. All right, let's talk about defense mechanisms. Okay, as I mentioned, these have been developed over the years and whatnot, and there's been lists included, but these are ones that what I would encourage you to do in practicing to become really good group facilitators, or if you're looking and going and being a therapist or a counselor, start looking for these in your interactions with other people and start practicing using them to kind of change your approach to the way that you're approaching that conversation or that situation. Because when a person starts doing these things, anything you really say from that point on is going to go in one ear and out the other. Okay. And this is really a place where during the group process, when group members start to display these types of behaviors and these approaches, as a facilitator, you need to step back and really look at your group dynamics, look at the situation, and figure out probably a different approach to helping that person or that group of individuals. So, the first and probably most common type and most natural type of defense mechanism is denial. Okay. And it's just not, it's simply not acknowledging that there is a problem. So, for example, in the example, a person diagnosed with HIV says, no, no, it didn't happen. It's a lousy doctor. I don't have HIV. But I'll bring this up in the field of addiction, especially if you're going to work with people who are coming to your addiction program because they were court ordered to, or it's part of a treatment program within a jail, prison, or mental health facility. Um, Many of the people that you'll interact with will say they don't have a substance use problem. They don't have a drinking problem. They're not an addict. Okay. And if you're faced with that, that's going to be the first challenge because if you can't get that person out of that denial phase, then they're just going to be there to clock their hours, to give it to their probation officer, to show the court that they did it. Okay. And that's just the honest truth. There hasn't been a person who has gone through a group process with denial has never then went all of a sudden and become a sober liver. I'm saying the wrong word. Living sober and non-addiction and all those kinds of things. There's not really a case of that just by doing that. So this is really one of the first challenges, especially when if you're doing court-ordered type treatments, is how do you get through that denial phase? Okay. However, there's other subtle ways that denial can happen, and I'll give kind of two examples. In example one, a person may have success, okay? And this largely happens with many survivors of abuse, individuals suffering from PTSD, especially individuals who are experiencing depression, okay? They may have a success in their life and maybe the facilitator about it and you in the group you say, you know what, I learned something about you this week, did this happen? And they minimize and deny that that happened. Okay. So in some instances, denial occurs when a person actually has a success, but they don't want to accept that success as theirs. Okay. Again, it's if that happens as the therapist, and we'll go through all the different skills about how to readjust and all that through this course, that's when you want to take a different approach. You want to think of a different way so that they can come to accept that success. The other one is, of course, failure. Again, if we use the addiction group, maybe someone has a relapse and they deny they had a relapse. Um, Maybe someone who their symptoms get worse. I can think of people who are suffering from borderline personality disorders who often deny that they're starting to go through the self-destructive cycle that they're experiencing. Okay. And so when you start to notice these things, either denying that something bad happened or something good happened during the group process, this is where you, as the facilitator, need to think, how do I adjust the approach? Okay. The next type of thing that I would encourage you to start looking for is repression. Okay. Now, this is suppressing a memory originally with Freudian theory. This is when a person purposely suppresses a memory until it disappears into the subconscious. Okay. I want to explain repression because it's not well explained in at least modern terms. Okay. You can't willingly forget something. Okay. Yes, if we have, a little bit of Alzheimer's or if we stress or maybe we have a dementia of some type or something like that. Yes, we can have troubles with recalling something that we thought we remembered very well. Okay. Those are called lapse of memory or lapse of thought. Okay. However, we can't choose to say, I'm not going to remember this. Okay. And probably one of the most simplest examples of repression in experiments, and this is a very, very simple example, is if I were to ask you to imagine in your mind a pink elephant. Okay. It could be a big, fluffy, stuffed pink elephant. It could be a live pink elephant. Some of my students say that they imagine Dumbo. Okay. But just get that image in your head. And then I ask you, forget about the pink elephant. And once you forget that pink elephant, let me know. And so have you raise your hands and stuff like that. It in on-campus classes, student would raise their hand and say, I forgot. And I had asked, well, what did you forget? Well, that pink elephant. All right. Well, you just remembered it again. And so the idea of purposeful repression, us making a conscious choice to forget something, really isn't possible. However, okay, and this is the big however, the brain does have mechanisms that when a person goes through some type of severe acute or chronic trauma, it can block a person's access to those memories. So, for example, I mentioned that I worked in the field of sexual abuse and sexual assault. And it was not uncommon for a woman, or even I worked with a couple men who were severely raped that they couldn't remember what happened for sometimes months to even years. Okay. Working with children into adults. I worked with many, again, men and women, young adults who started having memories of abuse when they were children. Okay, and it's new to them. They always had that blank spot in what they could remember about their childhood, but now that blank spot is being filled in. Okay. And so, what is going on here is that the brain does have mechanisms to block traumatic memories until the brain, I shouldn't give brain consciousness, but the brain feels that you are in a safe situation to remember that. Because I want you to think about the brain's purpose, primary purpose from a biological perspective is to keep you alive. That's its whole purpose. It doesn't care if you like Snicker bars or Starbucks. It cares that it's keeping you alive. Okay. Um, and so, given that primary purpose, sometimes the brain may feel, and again, giving something, I'm anthropomorphizing our brain, feels that that memory would put you more in danger of either harming yourself or harming others or being destructive. Okay. And so it can suppress or repress that memory. All right. And then when the person feels safe, they then can start recalling or having that memory. So again, when I worked with individuals who were severely sexually assaulted, okay, I always marked on my calendar to make sure I got a hold of them around 9 to 12 months after the event occurred. Okay. Why 9 to 12 months? It's because by about the 9 to 12 month, if it was an acute situation like a stranger rape or rape from someone, even someone they knew, by about the ninth to 12th month, they've gotten away from, usually, not always, usually they have some separation between them and their offender. Their life has started to stabilize. Their life has started to get semi-normal. And, I'd usually give a call around this time, and I'd usually hear things like, I smell something and I get really anxious and scared. I keep having these nightmares. I keep having these flashbacks. I see people with certain features and I have to run away from them. I can't be close to certain people anymore. Um, and that is an example of the brain has said, you're safe. Here you go. Okay. This is repression. Now, while it is difficult, I do want to mention this, that if people start recalling things in your group and whatnot, I want you to, instead of thinking, oh, this is negative, oh, they're recalling, oh, no, no, no. I want you to think about how can you manage this because they're on the right track. They're feeling safe in that group setting. And their trauma reaction is a reaction to the idea that you provided and your group members provided them with a safe place that the brain now is saying, okay, they're here. Let's release this. Now, the difficult part about this is noting the difference between person experiencing repression and then recalling memories and a person who's having a trauma response because they can look very similar. Because if you think about it, if you all of a sudden start having memories of things that happened to you, that's pretty traumatic. Okay. So when you start seeing this kind of thing, it's important to kind of maybe put the group on a pause and kind of talk to that individual on a one-to-one basis and kind of say, what's going on? And they may say something like, well, I just had this memory and I can't handle it. I can't deal with it. And then you go into crisis intervention mode with that situation, which we will talk about in this course. What are the skills of dealing with that kind of crisis when a person is dealing with that kind of thing? But an important note to note, if they're saying they're recalling things all of a sudden, note that on a positive end, you've put them in a safe situation where they could recall those memories. Now we just need to help them recall them in a safe, non-traumatic way. Okay. Now, with that being said, if you do have individuals who cannot remember trauma, they think trauma happened to them in their childhood, they think things happened to them, please refer them to a trauma expert, not a regular counselor. Don't say go back to your social worker, go back to whoever and whatnot. Because unfortunately, one thing we have found is that when a therapist thinks that this person is suffering from child trauma, they can seed trauma memories that never actually ever occurred. Okay. And so, for example, there has been cases, court cases, where the person, the grown up claimed that maybe their dad sexually violated them. during the summer of their 6-year birthday, and they note that, well, they spent the summer at the grandparents' house that year or something like that. And a lot of times, unfortunately, because of the therapist strongly believing the client was harmed as a child, there have been a lot of innocent people who had to go prove their innocence in court. Okay. So trauma experts are very important when you note someone saying, geez, I think something happened to me as a child, but I don't know. Send them to an expert who is trained in interviewing adults who think they may have been assaulted as children. Do not send them to a regular counselor or therapist. Okay. Because we want to make sure that those individuals who were truly harmed get the care they deserve and, in a lot of cases, the justice they deserve. Okay, off my soapbox on that. Let's go to the next one. Projection, putting your own beliefs or behaviors onto someone else. So in the example, it says talking about a stupid video game system is with someone else, believing that they must feel the same, even though they have never said so. That's kind of a strange example, but let me kind of break down projection. Projection is when I am so uncomfortable with my own beliefs and my own behaviors, I say that it's someone else who has this problem. So, for example, it's the addict who says, I'm not an addict. All addicts are like XYZ. It is, if we think about sexual predators, they go, I'm not a sexual predator because I don't look like it. I have a good job. I don't fit the stereotype. It is projection is putting something onto someone else because you're uncomfortable with your own ideas and beliefs, and you're not sure if that's okay or not. Okay. Projection in the group setting is when someone, again, if we go through the addiction thing, someone says, you know what? I don't have a drug issue, but I do see Bob over here. Bob, he obviously has an addiction issue. It's obvious, right, Bob? You're an addict. I'm not. Okay. And this is why Bob is an addict. And they start to describe their own beliefs and behaviors because they're so uncomfortable with them, they're putting it onto Bob or the other group member. I don't know why I came up with the word Bob. But that's projection. And when you start seeing that, it looks like they're blaming someone else, but it's like they're putting a mirror up in front of themselves and going, yeah, I'm not an addict, and I know nothing about this group member, but it's obvious that they do, and this is why. Okay. And so when you see that mirroring, it's like that person in the group that they're projecting onto, it's almost like they put up a mirror and they're really talking about themselves. Okay. Look for that. I will tell you that one place to look for projection, if you want to kind of explore this area, is in friendships and in intimate relationships. So, with your friends and intimate partners, kind of try and find these ideas because it can be simple projection like, yeah, I like this band and you do too. That's a very simple and harmless form of projection. Okay. A very dangerous one is when you have a friend that maybe you guys have a lot of fun and party with and whatnot and maybe one time you kind of do something stupid, well, we all do, and they say, well, if you didn't make me do that thing I did, we would have never gotten in that situation in the first place. Okay, that's a form of projection as well. Okay. All right, the next one is regression. Okay. Regression is acting in a way that is not typical of one's age. So it is, in the most basic form, this is when a person starts getting into a fetal position. That if you want to think about it physically close, when we talk about nonverbal behaviors. We'll talk about having arms crossed, legs crossed in the seat, all of those kinds of things. And it almost looks like they're getting crunched into a nut type shape, into a regress type state. It could include things that maybe a child would do behaviorally, but not necessarily you would as an adult. Okay. So, for example, um, I remember when I was a kid and I got hurt, but I didn't know what to do with that hurt. Okay. Sometimes I'd cry, but then sometimes I'd laugh. I don't know if any of you ever experienced that when you were a kid and maybe you fell or did something and you just weren't sure what to do, so you just kind of laughed. Okay. Um, those are all kind of forms of regression. We note with, and so let me kind of explain the regression process. Okay. Everyone has probably, I hope, in Psych 101 or somewhere in your trainings and whatnot, have heard about the fight flight response. Okay. The fight flight response is when we become extremely stressed, our body prepares itself to either fight or run away. Okay. Both of those take the same amount of physiological energy, meaning what happens is that the blood flow, the nerve attention goes from the core of the body to the extremities of the body, to the hands, the legs, those things you're going to either swing with or you're going to run with. And in extreme cases, if you've watched shows where a person is about to go into battle and they urinate themselves or they defecate themselves, that is a fight or flight response because what the body is doing is it's getting rid of anything that is taking up excess energy, like digestion. And so it's pushing out all of the urine and all the bile so it doesn't continue using resources to continue that process. Okay. Well, in our brain, it has a fight or flight response as well. Okay. So, as I hope many of you know, we have kind of two components to our brain. We have the amygdala, no, the limbic system, okay, which is kind of, if I were just to represent it by a ball right here, da da da. And then we have what are called the higher areas of the brain, which is the cortex, which sits on top of the limbic system. So, excuse my poor artwork. Okay. The cortex is what gives us our higher decision-making ability. It gives us our analytical abilities. It's what kind of keeps us adults. It's what we use as a way of acting human. Okay. The limbic system, if a species has a brain, it has a limbic system. The limbic system is that primary area of the brain that is survival based. It is what keeps us operating physiologically, and its primary purpose is survival. Okay. But we don't necessarily have complete access to it. Okay. And what happens when we have extreme um, fight or flight response is again, the blood flow and the energy used are shut off in these higher cortical areas, and the resources go to the limbic system, okay, where it is going to kind of take over and determine what needs to happen next, because it is, again, the survival part of our brain. And what it's going to use in order to survive is our most well-learned behaviors, okay? And what are our most well-learned behaviors? Well, our most well-learned behaviors we learn between the age of 3 and 6. Those are in the limbic system. They are set there. They're there. They're neurologically bound, and those are our most well learned responses to anything. Okay. And so, what does the limbic system do in order to respond? It responds based on those memories from 3 to 6 years old. So, there's a reason I brought up the laughing example. Okay, I brought up the laughing example because, again, working with survivors of domestic abuse or survivors of sexual violence, defense attorneys know this process very well. Okay. And so I use the laughing example because a technique that a lot of defense attorneys will do is they will have that survivor, quote unquote, also the victim, um, on the witness stand, and they will purposely ask stressing questions over and over and get the person so stressed that they have that fight or flight response that then the limbic system takes over. And maybe one of their learned responses when they were having stress or anxiety as a child was to laugh. And the person will do a sudden outburst of a laugh, and because they can't deal with it anymore. And the defense attorney will go, ha, see, this is a joke to them, that this is a joke. Judge, we should dismiss the case right now. This is obviously just a joke. Okay. Now, the only reason I bring that up is I've watched it several times in my pre-academic years, and they're very skilled at it. But that is the what is called regression. Oh, I'm drawing it in the wrong one. This belongs down here in the regression process. Okay. Again, you can see this in the group setting when a person is becoming very anxious about the topics that are being talked about the stories that are being told. So when you start seeing inappropriate kind of almost childlike behavior, such as laughing or avoidance or physically going into a fetal position, this is an important time to pause because that person is no longer going to be able to actively engage in that group process unless they're brought out of that fight or flight response. They start getting blood flow and energy back up into the cortical areas of their brain. It's going to be very difficult for that person to come out it, and if it continues, they can continue into that aggressive state, and they can probably will not show up to the next group that you have. Okay, so regression is an important one to look at because not only is regression psychological, it's going to be a physiological event. Okay, and knowing that is important. Okay, it's just not a person just acting out. There is a physiological reaction that is going on. The next one I want you to start to look for is what known as displacement. Okay. This is showing emotions towards someone or something totally unrelated to the event. Okay. So the example here is an alcoholic gets in a car accident when driving drunk and blames his wife who is at home. Okay. My example is working very commonly with people who are incarcerated. Okay. The most common response when a person is initially incarcerated and you ask them why they were here, they'll go, well, it was that damn cop. If that cop wasn't there, I wouldn't be there. I had a shitty attorney. That judge was unfair. Um, I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Okay. This is displacement. It's taking the cause of their emotional state of where they are right now and they're putting it on some other entity so that they feel that safe distance between the reason why they're in the place they're in and the reason that they were put there. Yes, Jamie, that's exactly what it is blaming everyone else but themselves. That's exactly what displacement is. Okay. And again, if you see this in the if you're going to work with people who have been incarcerated, this and denial are the first two things that you're probably going to have to work through. Okay. And you're probably going to have to really kind of help them come to a point of acceptance for what they did, and stop denying if they have an addiction problem or something else. That otherwise, you're just going to get them to come in that circular door with the criminal justice system. Okay. I will say this one, one of the things that noted in a lot of the research, especially dealing with incarcerated people, is once a person starts to accept that they committed a crime and that's why they ended up where they were, that is the number one predictor that they won't end up back into the criminal justice system. So if we can get individuals to then take that responsibility for their action and stop blaming everyone else, that's the case. Now, I do need to just take one step back though, because there are issues with social justice. There is some unfair system issues where a person may end up in the criminal justice system because of criminal justice issues, and so we do need to parse those things out. We need to understand those. But the idea behind getting over displacement is taking responsibility for the behavior itself. Um, and so that's a kind of an important aspect to consider when you're looking at displacement issues, because we do work with an unperfect system. But even when we're working with unincarcerated people, people who come to treatment willingly, and really want to resolve their problem, it is important to note displacement. I know, for example, working with offenders of domestic violence and sexual offenders, okay, they will note things like, well, if I wasn't raised in the family I was raised in, I wouldn't be where I am. If it wasn't for her, I wouldn't have done what I did. And you'll hear these displaced things. It's them that created this. The reason I'm here in this treatment group is because this. In anger management, you'll hear displacement all the time. Okay, even with people who are there because they know they have a problem and they're trying to solve their problem. So this is a good indicator of where the person is in their treatment process. Okay. If they stop displacing their behaviors, we're on the right track. We're on the right approach. Okay. And then the last one that we'll talk about is rationalization. Okay. Rationalization is making up some explanation based on some rational basis that then is twisted to make it sound like that what happened was okay. So for the example here is a rapist thinks that since the girl he is raping looked at him seductively one time, it must be okay to rape her. So this is what we often call victim blaming, right? If the victim wasn't dressed the way they were dressed, if the victim was not this and that and acted as most women who want it do, then she would have not been assaulted. Okay. This is an interesting one because statistically, many women who are raped, especially by um, 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 serial rapists, aren't the women who dress really nice, dress to the teeth, dress. They're not usually the ones that these little men go after. Okay. But they will still use that excuse that they looked at them wrong, or it was the way they were dressed. Anyways, I'm going to go off on victim blaming, which I shouldn't, but that's a form of rationalization. Okay. Um, and so you will see rationalization, for example, in addiction. So one rationalization that is very common is I worked really, really hard today and I deserve to unwind and have a drink. Okay. So working hard justifies the use of that substance. Okay. And that's a very, very common rationalization, especially with individuals who we call functional alcoholics, those ones that do go to work every day, but then they come home and they drink in excess. Okay. So those are some things to consider. And when you see these things, and again, I would, I would maybe, take this picture. I think it's in the textbook and just start practicing identifying these things in conversations, especially when you're noting conversations where there's stress at play, where a person is kind of being challenged on something, and look at how these play out. Um, and again, I would encourage you to note when you use these defense mechanisms, or these what are known as thinking errors. Because we all do. They're not just features of someone who has a dysfunction of some type. We all get uncomfortable once in a while with things that have happened to us and whatnot, and we all tend to do this. I'll tell you, I experience regression every time I go back up to the north. I'll just simple. I go from Dr. Peterson to little brother, in almost an instant, and we all use all of these. Okay, so. Let's see, what time are we at? We are at about that time. Okay, so I'm going to stop the sharing and I'm going to stop our